Thanks again for dropping in, and welcome back to the next installment of the Rex Reviews podcast. Lou McCoy, joined by TiborasaurusRex and Kacie Day, broadcasting this time from Dhulakal, Nepal.
Cardboard box behind the
tea house.
That is correct.
It's a magical spot. I can see why you bungee jumped from this magical country.
It is magical. I'm not going to lie. No, Dhulakal's got some really nice people in it, I got to say. Really, really sweet people.
All right, so we were getting into Rex's Bible study. One of the questions I wanted to pose today was, in the Bible, figurative and literal. I feel like there's people that pick and choose what parts of the Bible get to be literal, which parts get to be figurative, and they kind of make their own rules to follow whatever they want it to be. And in my experience and my study of the Bible, and I'm no expert by any means, but I have
Miss Kacie brings a fresh perspective to the conversation. That's one of the reasons why we like to have her here. Lou and I have already hashed a lot of this territory with our crazy rants late at night, talking about a lot of these things. But I think with Kacie, it's going to be really cool because she's going to offer a very fresh perspective from a totally unscripted, unbiased viewpoint. And I have no idea what direction she's about to go with the question. So this will be a good conversation, I'm sure. All right, shoot.
Well, great. I guess in my experience and in my study, the Bible is supposed to be taken as more of a figurative type of text. Just because at the time that it was written, a lot of their writings were done in like poetry and in symbolism, and there was a lot of that used at that time. So, and I mean, the Bible, of course, was written over thousands of years in many different places, but historically speaking, as far as what I've read up on it, is that it's supposed to be a much more figurative piece of work. The Bible is a piece of art. And it's supposed to be read as such, and there's a lot of symbolism used. And so for there to be so many people that take words from the Bible and make them straight literal, unless it's the Ten Commandments, but to over-literalize the Bible is almost, not only taking away from the actual meaning, but just totally destroying a piece of art.
Well, that's a very interesting commentary. That's probably one of the most common views on it. And actually, I would have to agree with you in the heart of that statement, saying that let's say everything in the Bible is 100% literal, which obviously there is metaphor in the Bible. The four horsemen of apocalypse, I sure hope that ain't literal. Like an actual horse, like pooping from the sky that's like 600 feet high. It could happen if that's what God wants to do, man. That's fine. But obviously some of it's literal. But even let's say that most like all of Genesis and Exodus and all that stuff is 100% literal, right? The people a lot of times who get enthusiastic about explaining the historical validity of the scriptures, we'll put it like that, or the scientific validity, assuming from their perspective they say it's literal, use it then as kind of a weapon to gain some kind of spiritual or intellectual hierarchy superiority over someone else who doesn't believe it, and they use it to further refine their perch on top of everyone else in their little Pharisee land class. So a lot of times, let me put it like this. I'm one that actually, a lot of the stuff in the Bible that people do think or suspect might be figurative, a lot of that stuff, in my opinion, might possibly be literal from my perspective. And we can talk about specific examples. However, the last thing I ever want to do is use that to I am holier than you because you don't believe the Bible as much as me. And if you were smart, you would know how literal it is because you're not familiar with the ancient, and it gets into this deal where it's in totally the wrong spirit, because you are correct. The correct spiritual interpretation of the scripture, if it truly is geared to help us become more familiar with God and his goodness, would be a positive deal, which is that it should be taken spiritually. The interpretation thereof should be taken in a way that adds spiritual stature to you. There are lessons. Lessons are usually beyond the literal. You know what I mean? The literal is used to communicate things sometimes, right? There are many different ways to communicate general truths in life. And I think the Bible does that a lot of times. A lot of times there are parables that Jesus told, for example, where he would tell a story, necessarily not being a true story. Maybe they all were true, but sometimes he's like, there was Lazarus and the dead man or whatever, right? And then he goes to the story about all that stuff that happened. And there's bazillions of examples from the text. But yeah, so the heart of your message is that the gear of the book is to add more of a complex dynamic understanding of the character of God rather than to give you the Nazi approved version of like, this is what happened on the 14th day, not the 15th day. And then they argue. I'm like, okay, so the 14th day and the 15th day, and that stuff, I think details are important to comprehending the fullness of the story, but you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater on that deal and like get too focused in on the mechanics and the details and miss out on the heart. It's like Jesus told those Pharisee guys, because they were like that. They were super strict on the text. They're like, Moses said this. And they were like lawyers, the way they looked at it. And they're like, because he said this, there's no leeway, there's no interpretation. We interpret it as being this, and that's the way it's going to be. And if you don't do this, you're a bad person, and we are going to shred you. And Jesus told these guys, he's like, hey, guys, you guys bow down to the letter of the law, but you violate the heart of the law. So even if you were correct on the letter of the law, which they were usually correct technically, but they violated the whole point of the law, was to align you and position you in such a direction where you could see what the Almighty was trying to gift to you. You know what I mean? So I think that that's always an important thing people have to come into the conversation with if they want to actually, that's why they pray before they have their Bible studies, right, Lou? You got to pray first. And I don't mean to be sarcastic. I just, so many churches do such a terrible job on this aspect is they get so enthusiastic about being superior, they forget the whole point of reading the book in the first place. Like, how someone can read that book and then come out with a conclusion and act like the way they do. If you want to summarize the entire Bible into one colloquial phrase, it'd be, thou shalt not be an asshole, right?
Well
so
said.
like, why would we read that thing to all of a sudden become more obnoxious, right? So that's a lot of times what fuels people too, and even people who have questions about like different stories in the Bible, like Genesis. There's some stuff in there that's like, what? Is that what really happened? Or like the story of the Red Sea parting, right? Like, is that a metaphor? Is that a historical account of what actually happened in real life with Pharaoh? Is this a kind of a legend deal? Was it exaggerated? Whatever that might be, and we'll just leave all those options on the table for the time being. Whatever the conclusion should be, it's trying to teach you a lesson about stuff. And if we focus on the details or the historical validity of things so much, a lot of times people miss that message. And a lot of people who don't even think it's literal actually come up to the heart of the conclusion of the matter better than the other ones because they're too busy yelling at everyone else to have the exact picture in their mind. And that's the thing with literature, man, is like you can communicate things with words various ways. Now, in the Bible, there are a number of things that are to be taken figuratively. And a lot of times they're defined that way, like a king has a dream about skinny cows. Well, it's a dream, right? It ain't actual skinny cows like getting eaten by these, remember the dream that the guy had, Nebuchadnezzar went nuts or whatever? Okay. So there's a lot of different Bible stories, or like when a prophet has a vision, right? A prophet like trips out on this vision and he's going to town on something like the book of Revelation, right? We'll just start there. Talking about like a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns and like all, there's like they had the parts of a bear and the parts of a lion and all this. I don't think that that's literal. It's symbolism. So symbolism, you could categorize that probably. You're a literature guy, Lou. I mean, you can join in here, but is symbolism and metaphor would be in the same general category, right?
Yeah, if you want to group them like that, it's a form of expressing it figuratively.
Yeah.
Rather than literally.
Yep. And a lot of times, one of the reasons why a lot of stuff in the Bible is communicated in the form of a metaphor, we'll call it a metaphor, or a symbol, is so you can condense way more information in a picture. You can get a whole giant concept just by like a lion. Holy crap, a lion. And then you can go on for paragraphs about what a lion is. Everyone knows what a lion is. Therefore, you can now use that concept of a lion, like the roaring lion of the tribe of Judah. Like that statement carries a lot more weight because you just use a very colorful metaphor. Is the Messiah really a lion? No. When Jesus said, I am the doorway, I am the light, like did he actually mean he's a literal doorway or the bread of life situation? If you want to get into that category too, there's a lot more in-depth communication being conveyed in all those concepts, right? So like when they use a metaphor, you're actually adding information. It's not that it's less cool on the scale of coolness as far as God communicating stuff like, oh, it's only a metaphor. It's not as good as if it was literal. If it's only literal, a lion's like, okay, a lion stood there, then what happened? But no, it's a metaphor. It's communicating something huge and awesome and great. So just in a general sense, that's a good way to look at a lot of that stuff.
And you put it real well because it's all pictures at the end of the day. And these pictures convey the human experience, and all these different stories make the tapestry that makes the Bible such a work of art.
Yep. And there's an old rabbi / guy or something. I seen him on one of these news shows, actually, on cable TV on the computer there. And someone was asking about the Tower of Babel. And trying to figure out, well, was that thing literal or fake, or what happened there? Like, did they actually build a tower, King Nimrod, after the flood that got torn down and all the languages were created? Well, the point of that story is something a little bit different. Now, I don't know, and this is the other thing to consider too. A lot of times, all right, let's say something is actual literal. It's only literal because it's conveying something much more beyond that, right? Well, so like Nimrod built the tower and it was bad. Well, that doesn't tell you a whole lot. It was bad to build a tower. Like, so Sears Tower is bad or what? I mean, like the Empire State Building, there's more information there. If you pay more close attention to the words being used and you look at the story, it's telling a story. There's multiple levels of communication. So if you look at the example of the Tower of Babel, you can look at that in multiple different ways. You can look at it as just being purely literal. It's a very concise passage. There's not a lot of stuff written there. Or you can look at it, okay, what's really being said? And there's a way you can look at it with Nimrod says he wants to build a tower, okay? Tower in quotation marks, okay? A tower is representing something here. And let us make brick, he says, to build this tower, quote marks, right? And what are these bricks? They're humans, right? This is one possible metaphoric interpretation of the Tower of Babel, for example. Okay, what's a human? A human is like a unique creature. God's tower, God's temple, he says he's going to make it out of living stones, uncut stone. When they built the temple, they could not cut the stones. It had to be uncut. No human could shape the stone with cutting tools. Why? Because God knew that each one of those stones was unique in its own way and would fit together perfectly. Only the master turbo architect guy could possibly fit that stuff together. And he understands that each rock's unique. So we are all living stones in the body of Christ. It says, stacked upon one upon another, right? On the foundation stone, which is the Messiah, Christ or whatever, right? That concept of what he stood for even, right? Beyond just the guy in the robe, right? Because he stood for something. That's why he was so awesome. If he just existed, it's not a big deal. But it's what he stood for and what he did and what he communicated and what he unleashed was like, whoa, that's pretty heavy duty. So when you're looking at these stones in the Tower of Babel, Nimrod wasn't happy with that because Nimrod wants to be the boss. He's not as good of an architect as the creator to be able to stack all these unique stones. So what is he going to do? He's going to shape these people. He's going to put them into shape. He's going to make a bunch of rules. He's going to cut down their personality. He's going to mold them. He probably invented a public education system. He probably squared them right off so they're all bricks in a wall. All in all, we're just another brick on the wall. We don't need no more education, all that business, right? Nimrod was what Pink Floyd The Wall was probably writing about.
Well, how can you have your pudding if you won't eat your meat? And how can you have your meat if you won't eat your pudding?
Exactly. But yeah, so there's an example of like, okay, and if you look at the metaphor, so Nimrod, the only way he can build his crappy earthly kingdom is to shape people all to be identical. And what do we have in modern society? Again, now in these days, same deal. We're all put into shape. If you're in the church, you're wearing a suit, you're sitting there, you're being quiet. Only one guy's talking. He's directing everything. No one's allowed to be different. You're not allowed to have a different personality or get too squirrely or get too funny, because God forbid that you might be a unique stone that God invented. Mm-hmm. How is Nimrod supposed to stack them anywhere he wants? Because you might have a unique place in the universe that God put you in, and only he knows where that goes. So that takes away the control from the manipulators and the tyrants from doing it. So if you look at the Tower of Babel story in the light of metaphor, holy smokes, does it unleash a lot more understanding on what's really going on. And that doesn't mean it didn't also literally happen too. But I think he probably did build a big tower. And there's representations artistically of the tower being the big spiral tower going up. He probably built a tower. Maybe he was building a CERN device that he's trying to open up a new dimension so he could get at God. Maybe the tower was a rocket where he's going to get into outer space and try to meet God up there. Who knows what was going on? They had technology in them days, maybe, right? So there's a million ways this could have actually happened. Maybe it was just a skyscraper. Maybe there was no tower and it was all talking about Nimrod's society of stones versus bricks. And he used mortar to put them together. That's another interesting thing. If you look in the Hebrew, the word mortar has similarities to the words for materialism that they use for like, okay, how are we going to, like, in the God's temple, there's no mortar, there's no materialism. Them things fit seamlessly together perfectly. They just sit there awesome, right?
But if you cut them, you need mortar.
Yeah, because all of a sudden it's way not as cool. I mean, it's not like locked together through the different geometry of the shapes, right? Mm-hmm. So now you need mortar. You need stuff to glue your crappy fake kingdom together, your house of cards. So you got to use glue now, right? And so he used materialism. He got people focused on worldly things, and then that's what glued the kingdom together, see? So when you look at the Tower of Babel story, it's incredible when you look at it with a metaphorical perspective. And as a piece of artwork, which that story certainly is, it makes a lot more sense than purely sitting there and saying, it talks about Nimrod's tower. I believe this is literal. And if you don't believe it's literal, you don't believe the Bible. And it's not a correct deal. You're not a true whateverist. And you're going to, that's how that sermon could have went. Okay, so like you missed out on some cool stuff.
Yes, you did.
No, you can add that literal part in there if you go into the more like, okay, now, so what happened? What was the lesson that Nimrod learned? And you can, but it's multiple meanings, man. I mean, Genesis can be looked at the same way. A lot of people think Genesis is literal. And a lot of people think it's totally metaphoric. Or a lot of people think it's a hybrid of them trying to rearrange words and explain things in a way that communicates the point of the book of Genesis, for example, the creation of the universe, right? The point of the book of Genesis that everyone should conclude when they read it is God made stuff. God's the guy that made stuff. He designed it. That's the point of the book. Whatever that God force is, we can argue on that later. Doesn't matter. But the idea of that book is that. Now, if we want to get into the details, that's fine. And if people want to debate, for example, evolution versus creation, the literal interpretation of the Bible versus the scientific explanation of the age of the earth and all this stuff, that's an interesting conversation for sure. But we don't want to neglect from actually getting the meaning out of the text either, right?
Exactly. Because there is literal and figurative and metaphor and symbolism in every story.
Absolutely.
And if you take something too seriously or you try to dissect it too far, you'll miss the entire point of it all.
And there's a thing in the Bible, too, called typology, which is where these stories repeat themselves, because the Bible is basically, the way I see it, is God's trying to communicate the way the world works with humans in charge versus with God in charge, like in the Garden of Eden until they screwed it up, right? Mm-hmm. So when we're in charge, there's this repeated pattern of destructive behavior and struggles that we go through, and how do we mitigate these struggles? And so the same story kind of repeats itself over and over and over again. And you look at Moses, right? You have this guy, and he's in slavery, and all his people are in slavery in Egypt, right? And they're totally oh man, we're slaves. Okay, so you can look at this on an individual level, right? So I'm a dude, I'm in slavery to my sin, or I'm in slavery where I'm at, whatever I'm a slave to, right? And we need the deliverer to come and find us and get us out of here. So who's the deliverer represent? Who's Moses represent? Moses is having a clue that someone else behind him is going to come later who's going to help you get delivered, right? And so he takes these people out of Egypt through the powerful hand of God, which is powerful to get rid of all that crap in your life or whatever, right? Metaphorically speaking. So they escape the tyranny of the destructive behavior patterns. And then if you look at it symbolically, they go and they cross the Red Sea, right? So what's that? Well, you got to get across, and then you talk about later on, there's people that have to go through water to get to a certain place, right? The whole baptism situation they're talking about. And then if you go into then you're wandering around after that. You're not totally quite in the promised land of milk and honey yet. You got to wander around in Saudi Arabia for 40 years. And that's life. Screwing up, getting killed by different army guys, all these guys trying to kill you. struggling with like all these different like gods from different countries and all the stuff that we got to struggle with. So that whole story, when you look at it metaphorically, makes a lot more sense in an individual person's life. And that's where the true solid gold of those communications might be, is looking at the symbolism in those stories. Now, people can argue, did that literally happen? Well, that can be a topic for another day.
The question might be, does it matter?
That's a really good question, too.
Does it even matter? Or should we just look at the message and the symbolism and try to...
The argument there would be like, well, if it doesn't matter, then it's a lie. But is a metaphor a lie just because you're explaining the way something works? No, I don't think so. So some people think it's literally true. Some people don't think it's literally true. But either way, the conclusion should be the same, that there's information communicated either in what actually happened or what someone said was the story. Both ways it communicates the same deal, hopefully. And that's where the contention comes through the literal versus the figurative. But honestly, from my perspective, dude, I can work with either one. Like, either one works fine. I do have my personal opinion on, but it goes... There are certain parts in the text, if you want to get into it, like you can tell, like, okay, was Genesis meant to be a historical account? And some people, if you look at it, use an analysis of like the verb structure in the Hebrew. Was this done as a metaphor or a rhyme or a song or something that was intended to be like a piece of art? Or was it more of a history timeline? And so the book of Genesis, for example, people argue that it does have a structure that it looks like whoever wrote that intended it was almost like a history book, because they got the lineages that are kind of boring and the way they're arranged is very interesting. So there's a lot of different arguments in there, but that's something we can individually hammer those out over the next series of podcast situations. But yeah, that's a good one to get out of the way before we get into any of those topics. And that's a really good question you asked there too, is like when you're talking literal versus figurative, the conclusion should be the same. We recognize that these ancient writings have value because it's cohesively held societies together for thousands of years very effectively. Look, they're still sitting over there. And all the Europeans are halfway doing it too, because they continued with their version of it, right? So like these things all communicate very powerful things that obviously created something. So, and those things are reflected in other writings around the world too, not to be, ignored totally. So that's my opinion on literal versus figurative.
So at the end of the day, you should just take away the message.
Well, that's the point of that stuff getting written down one way or the other is that we can get the message out of the deal, the moral of the story, as they call it, right?
Exactly. Well said there, Mr. Rex. Anything else?
I guess kind of just wrapping it up, too, is that the Bible should definitely be approachable to anyone. And I think getting too literal is something that people used previously as a means of control over people, and you kind of were talking about that as well. I just think as a multifaceted piece of literature, it should be read and interpreted and...
Yeah, and it's silly really for people to try to categorize it one way or the other because it's a collection of various books from a bunch of different authors. Like a lot of different people wrote about stuff, and a lot of times they're writing about a story that they heard, or writing about some like a dream, like we said, or a vision, or there's a million different things where they're telling a story. There's like frame stories in there too. So to say that categorically it's literal or it's not literal is kind of like not wise when you consider how many books are in the thing. So you have to look at each different little story by itself to see, okay, is this a literal deal that happened? And if it is, does it matter? Like, it's communicating a truth here, which would be true if it happened that way, right?
Well, and I think also, it being written from so many different perspectives to try and force an entire group of people to see it in one way, takes away from it.
And I think that's one of the enemy's tactics, too, whatever bad vibratory force is out there screwing everyone up, man. I think that he's going to get us focused on the gears of the engine rather than driving the car. We're going to be arguing about if the bolt is in the right place or not, and we're not even driving the car anywhere. Meanwhile, he's robbing all our stuff out of the trunk. So we don't want to get distracted by the countermeasures of the enemy thrown off his flack. So.
Literally or figuratively, we're going to take a quick break and be back with one final segment of the Rex Reviews podcast.